Hi, Frontline Teach. This is Val Soul, part of Philadelphia Fight's Education Department and HR, and I'm excited to talk with you today about sex and gender. It is important for me to say that if sex and gender were uncomplicated, we wouldn't have to spend any time on it, but it's complicated and we want to spend time on it. Fundamentally, I want to share that gender is more complicated than it seems. Sex isn't just about intercourse and it isn't just about genitalia, and that the experiences of those people who live outside the binary, like myself, are relatable, understandable, and natural. And further, you don't need to know every detail of someone's gender in order to show them respect. I tend to share in educational settings such like this so that others don't get asked. I want to provide some context, I want to provide some terms, and my transition from this, boy crazy little schoolgirl to today, the gender variant queer woman with a beard who I am, is more than I can cover in this slideshow. I want to talk with you about it more. But let me tell you this, what most people want to know is, what were you assigned at birth? And I was assigned female at birth. When I came out, the doctor and my mom and my dad said, "Oh, it's a girl," not knowing what the course of my life was going to contain. And that's very much the conventional wisdom about gender, that there are two boxes. There's a box with an M and a box with an F, and everybody fits inside one of those boxes. And everyone in the same box looks, acts, and feels the same way about the others in their box and the people in the other box, and that the boxes are one size fits all. And furthermore, that everyone in the same gender box wants to have romantic and sexual relationships only with people from the other gender box. Now, obviously, we know this isn't the case. Sex, gender, orientation, these are interrelated concepts, but they're not the same thing. And if you're watching this and you don't fit perfectly into a gender box, you're not alone, and it doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. The other thing to say is that sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation can all change over time. They're not stuck in one place forever. And you don't have to have one identity or expression for the whole course of your life. Now, there are sort of four important axes that I just mentioned. Gender identity is the internal understanding of one's own self and what gender you are. Gender expression is the external sense of gender, the external expressions of what your gender is. And this can be anywhere from sort of clothing or hair or makeup choices to do you hold the door for people, or do you expect to have the door held for you? Kind of social cues. There's also the axis of biological sex, the physical anatomy, and then there's sexual orientation, how your physical and emotional attraction to other people expresses itself. This is what we call the genderbread person. It's pronounced metrosexual.com is the source for this, and this is a thing that I use in teaching all the time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but I want to point out that they have identified these four axes: gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and attraction, and have provided a lot of different settings for different people, different combos along these different genders. So part of the point of this is that everybody has a place on the genderbread person. Everybody has a place on these sliders. The genderbread person, I don't want to non-consensually say people should just get on him, but everybody's got a place on the slider. It is not just trans people who have a gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, or attractions, obviously. So gender identity is internally understood, and there are questions that I've come up with, and that some of the people I've worked with have come up with, that it is very easy for people to take these questions for granted when they're lucky enough to have their assigned gender and their gender identity line up neatly. What is your gender? How do you know for sure? When did you find out? Have you always had that gender? Has your assigned gender always fit? are there ways in which your understanding of yourself or ways that your behaviors don't fit inside the box of your assigned gender? For a lot of people not very exposed to trans populations, the idea that someone has a gender that needs to be assessed internally and that might be different from what their external expression of gender is a lot of times a foreign concept if someone is really new to this. But for those of us who live in this world, it's really plain for me to see anyways that these are questions that I have had different answers for over time. And I don't know that I'll continue to have the same answers going forward. I know what my answers are right now. Gender expression, as I mentioned, is exhibited through social markers. So the social markers of gender include body language, hair, clothing, accessories, the volume of your voice. There's all sorts of things, all sorts of ways that we mark gender, both physically and socially. So here's a picture of two kids, and I chose this picture because you might think you know the gender of these babies, but actually we have no idea. And the idea that girls wear pink and boys wear blue has only really been in place since the 40s. It's not an eternal truth about the world that girls are pink and boys are blue. And so I really loved this picture because we have no idea who these babies are, what their deal is, what gender they feel like they are inside, and what gender they're going to feel like they are when they're 40. So this is one of my favorite things to say. The use of binary words to describe gender is not proof that gender is binary. It is proof that our descriptions of gender are limited. What is biological sex? So sex and gender are often used indiscriminately for each other. They're often used interchangeably. But sex is very much about the physical, biological markers of gender. And there are two sets of markers. There are primary markers and secondary markers. So the primary markers of gender are the exterior sex organs and the interior gonads. Gonad is one of my favorite words, by the way. But these markers are not as what am I trying to say? There are more ways that the sex organs can look on the exterior and ways that they can look on the interior than the conventional wisdom about M and F. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about infant genital mutilation, which is one of the ways that the medical establishment has sought to rectify fix primary sex markers, even sometimes without parental consent, much less infant consent. So the primary markers, though, are the thing that gets counted. When you say, do you have a boy or a girl? That what we're talking about are just this piece of sex. But there are also a number of secondary markers of sex, which are physical, biological, and origin, but not equally applied across the board. So in humans, secondary markers of sex include breasts, body hair, limb size, the enlarged larynx or your Adam's apple, someone's Adam's apple, I don't know if you have one, your bone structure, your stature, the fat patterns, fat growth and distribution patterns, your actual hormones and lab work. And so there are some things that, in addition to that, that we can measure but rarely bother to, like DNA. So one of the things that I want to point out is that, again, the kind of conventional wisdom about M and F is that M's have XY and F's have XX, and never the twain shall meet. But there are actually many more variations of XX and XY than get counted, and we don't often know because it often doesn't make a difference unless someone's sick or ailing in some sort of way. So we actually don't necessarily, you can't necessarily assume that just because someone's physical appearance is any one way, that their biological or their genetic markers match the way that you think they look. So Some physical markers can change. I had mentioned infant mutilation. So it's estimated that 1 out of 100 births have non-normative physical sex markers. That is, it is not easy for a doctor to discern upon sight what gender someone's external sex organs are in the moments after birth. So 1 or 2 out of 1,000 births receive surgery to normalize physical sex markers. And sometimes, as I mentioned, the parents aren't even told about this. I think that this is something that is probably lessening in frequency, but it is definitely a thing that has affected friends of mine, people who later in life found out that they in fact did have a genital, as they say, correction in the day or two right after birth, that has greatly affected their sense of self and their sort of like sense of continuity with their own gender. So there are other examples of this that are non-surgical. For example, some women, like myself, have facial hair. I don't take hormones to have facial hair. I have facial hair because I have facial hair. My mom's side of the family all has facial hair. They could have probably tipped me off, but they didn't. And I inherited these patterns. I hid them for a long time. I hid my facial hair for a long time. And at a certain point, I decided that I was sick of fighting it and that I was going to keep my facial hair. There are actually a lot of women who have facial hair and hide it every day. A lot more women than you would think. But I can often tell because when I pass by, they stroke their chins. We also know that some men have breasts or develop breasts. And sometimes that is a real problem for them and is about other health issues that might be going on, and sometimes it's just the way that the fat distribution happens. And I guess this isn't really a thing that changes except for with age, but people of all genders have hands of all sizes. There's not the sort of determinism that, like, oh, you have large hands, so therefore you must be male. It's just not that simple. That's not the way that genes actually work. So there are guidelines for folks who are in a sort of provider role with trans people. There are treatment guidelines for LGBTQ care, as well as care for transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people. And so I would be happy to provide you with more information about this. I know you can't click through on the slideshow, so I'm happy to send these links out to anyone who needs them. Please let me know. One of the primary points of doing this presentation is to underline what it means to treat someone respectfully. So number one on this is to use their chosen name, and usually it's how they introduce themselves. It's pretty rude to say, oh, well, that's the name you're telling me, but what's your real name? The name they're telling you is their real name, even if you have a sense that maybe their gender history is complicated. If you're unsure or if you can't figure it out from context, it's okay to ask what pronoun someone prefers. If it's not possible to ask, you should use the pronoun that's consistent with their appearance or gender expression. I also want to say that it is okay to use they as a singular pronoun if you're not sure, and actually I feel respected personally when people aren't sure what pronoun to use and they use they guess they. That feels like respectful to me. It doesn't feel respectful to everybody, but for me, that works for me. So everybody's not going to have the same stance on that. And it is possible, particularly if you're working with a lot of folks who are trans, that you might make a mistake. So the recommendation is to accept being corrected gracefully and move on. People often don't want to talk about it all day long. And if you end up being corrected a couple of times, to continue to accept being corrected, take it in terms of growth in trying to respect this person. I want to make this point. The idea is not to read minds and guess the right name or pronoun every time. The respect is to show that person you're working with the respect you would like to be shown. So vocabulary trends and vocabulary both about gender and orientation is evolving constantly, and these are just some of the terms that you may come across. They obviously, I actually had about 2 more slides that won't all fit here, and it doesn't make sense to me to just kind of like flip past slides of vocab words. Again, I welcome folks to reach out to me if you want more information about any of these. I know a couple of good glossaries. And there are also words that people use to describe their orientation. There are also more of these than I've actually put here. It's honestly, even for myself who keeps up on this, it's hard to keep up. So there are some terminology, some words that I can safely recommend that you avoid. Transgenders, I should actually also have put transgendered with an ED here. Trannies, she-males, ladyboys, trans women, trans men as one word together. Trans or transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun, and to use it as such is a little bit objectifying. I want to pay attention to the asterisk here. Trans with an asterisk is a little bit, it's a bit of a library nerd way of saying wild card, as in we know that there might be people here or people within the audience that's going to read this that identify within the trans spectrum, but we probably haven't used their word. So the trans with an asterisk is a little bit of a nod to how many more terms there might be. I also want to recommend that you avoid using any of these terms to talk about non-trans people. If somebody says, oh, a biological woman, or a genetic woman, or a natural woman, or a born woman, women-born women, to me what that says as someone of trans experience is that you think I must be made of silicon or something, that I'm not natural, biological, or organic in origin. We're all people. So the preferred term for non-trans folks is cis, which is a prefix that means on the same side as, whereas trans means on the other side as. So trans implies a sort of transition from one gender to another, whereas cis implies that you are happy with the gender that you were assigned at birth. These are the acronyms that you may see for that. Now, fundamentally, we all have the right to make choices. Adults in particular have the absolute right to make choices about our bodies. We believe that everyone has this right in Project Teach. Self-determination, particularly the self-determination of people living with HIV and AIDS, is something that has always fueled our movement. And we extend this understanding to people's right to love who they're going to love and be in their body the way that works for them. Now, some people do have fewer choices. Youth under 18 are very constrained in the choices that they can make, and youth are coming out earlier than ever. So this is just a place where I'm going to plug the Philadelphia Trans Health Conference, which is in mid-June this year and most years recently. It's a great conference that has a lot of stuff going on for it, but the thing that it's most known for is actually like helping the parents of trans youth. It has built a broad community of trans youth, parents, and providers who come together every year and literally define the state of the art together. Every article I've ever seen about parenting trans youth references the Trans Health Conference in some way because it's just that fundamental for that community. So, in summary, I hope that this presentation helped you to understand the differences between sex and gender, gender identity and gender expression, and gender and orientation. I hope that it gave you some context about LGBTQ participants or friends and family that you might have. And fundamentally, this is kind of ambitious, but I want this presentation to improve the world. I'm not content to wait until it gets better, and I think the It Gets Better project is pretty cool, but it is sort of a privileged stance to say, well, just hang in there, it gets better. Well, no, I want the world to be better now for people who need it to be better now. So I welcome your comments. My email address is vsoul@fight.org. We turn comments off on the YouTube page because we answer them like librarians, and that's a little bit unwieldy. But I do welcome your feedback and your communications. All right. My thanks to Anita and Cade for their time, and my thanks to you for yours.